Hello everyone, welcome to our course International Organization and Global Governance, Chapter 2, World Order Proposals. Let's start with learning objectives. At the end of this chapter, you will be able to recount the philosophy of the world government proposal. You can evaluate the role of legalism in international studies. You can also criticize the premises of functionalism and neofunctionalism. You will be able to summarize the arguments of cosmopolitanism, and you can recognize the balance of power and collective security as major systems for managing power relations. This chapter includes 5 main titles. The first one, world government; the second one, legalism; the third one, functionalism; the fourth one, cosmopolitanism; and finally, the chapter focuses on collective security and the balance of power as systems for managing power relations. Let's start with world government proposal. First of all, world government proposal considers that one authority should be necessary for the sustainment and also creation of a world order at the global level. So world order can be defined as, can be created by a hegemon. For instance, we can give examples Pax Romana or Pax Britannica, which were created by a hegemon, by a powerful state in the history. And also we know that this theory gained more prominence after the Second World War. So after 2 world wars, in fact. Who are the prominent world governmentalists? Emery Reeves is one of the supporters of this very proposal, and he argues that he's against any internationalist approach, and he argues that war exists due to national states or due to division of the world into nation states, and he argues that the solution to the war can be creation of a world government or central authority over all states. So this is the solution for Reeves to the war. Another prominent figure, another prominent supporter, advocate of world government is Kurt Meyer. He argues that we can turn United Nations into a world government, for instance. There are also criticisms against this approach. The first one is that creating a central authority, a world government, can be a threat to individual freedoms. And also some people argue that this is a utopian idea which cannot be realized. And also some scholars argue against this proposal that it has some flaws in its analogy with the domestic politics. The second proposal is the legalism. Legalism considers that international law can be an exclusive means to create a world order. So they emphasize the importance of international law, and they argue that the world unity can be established around a common global law. Who are the proponents of legalism? Hans Kelsen is the important supporter, thinker of this approach. His book Peace Through Law is important, and he argues in this book a durable peace can be achieved within the framework of international law. Greenville Clark and Louis Schoen also important supporters of legalism, and they have a book called World Peace Through World Law, and they argue that United Nations can deal with the issues, world issues, and they argue that within the United Nations there can be 2 tribunals, 2 courts, in order to focus on the world problems with from a legal perspective. There are also some criticisms against this approach as well, and people or scholars argue that this approach has a domestic analogy which is flawed again, and they argue that what can be from a pragmatic approach, what are the benefits for human beings if there's some sort of legal approach or legalism in the world. And also they argue that this approach is dogmatic and static in its outlook for a world order. On the other hand, functionalism is another proposal regarding the world order. Functionalism emphasizes the cooperative nature of world politics. So functionalists argue that there can be cooperation in the world, so it's not impossible. And they also argue that cooperation can start in non-political issues, then it can spill over to political cooperation, which we can consider the European integration as an example of this statement. And we know that the David Mitrani is the most important advocate of functionalism. There is another version of functionalism, which is called neofunctionalism. Neofunctionalism specifically focuses on the European Union, and Ernest Haas is the proponent of neo-functionalist approach, which again argues that cooperation, which started, for instance, in the creation of steel and coal community and in the 50s, spilled over to other political fields when we look at the European integration process. There are also some critics against this approach as well. Scholars argue that this approach, functionalism, assumes that war as a result of economic and social backwardness, but which is not. And they argue that this approach or this proposal is based on an assumption of separability between non-political issues and political issues. So they say that we cannot separate issues always as non-political and political. And also they argue that this approach gives priority to non-political issues. Another problem is that they consider that problems or cooperation problems can be solved by separating issues between political ones and non-political ones. But a group of scholars argue that problems cannot be solved by just simply separating political issues from non-political issues. Another group of critics says that this approach is biased against the state, and also scholars say that the arguments of functionalism is kind of a wishful thinking. Another word proposal approach is cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism has some sort of basic arguments regarding the world order. For instance, they say that in the contemporary world, environmental conditions are emerging as a basic threats. So state should be transformed according to a response to these new types of threats to human beings. And also they argue that there should be some sort of distributive justice at the global level, and also they argue that the need for new institutions at the global and local levels in order to meet these changing conditions. Charles Bates is the most important figure of cosmopolitanism, and also there are other group of scholars which is called World Order Modus Project scholars. They also advocates cosmopolitanism as a significant approach which can create world order. What are the criticism of this approach? This approach is against the state, or they have a problematic approach towards the state. People say that states fulfill critical functions, so we should pay attention to the state. And also another problem is, they argue or they try to defend distributive justice. Well, it is really hard to achieve. It's not an easy project. And also a global definition of justice, if we find, needs a powerful central authority, which cannot be realized within the contemporary conditions of international relations. And final critic is the problem of its domestic analogy, which floats. The final topic is collective security and the balance of power. These are two different systems for managing power relations. When we look at collective security, it's defined as a partially centralized system for managing power relations around the world. So this, for instance, the League of Nations was created on the very on this very idea, and Woodrow Wilson were supporting this idea, the creation of collective security for all nations. But there are some other scholars, such as James Shotwell, Gilbert Murray, Nicholas Butler. They advocate the creation and sustainment of collective security for world order. According to collective security, the use of force must be regulated by a central agency, and ultimately this idea is relied on military power. It is kind of a one for all for one proposal. Balance of power, on the other hand, is a decentralized system for power management. People argue that, or scholars argue that, balance of power is kind of a fallback system of international system. So international system generally creates some sort of balance between different actors if there is no other option. And but we know that the balance of power has been modified by creating international organizations and military alliances in 20th century. So to conclude, in this chapter, we first focus on the proposal, world government proposal, and then we discussed the legalism, and as a third topic, we also considered functionalism. We also look at cosmopolitanism, and finally, we have seen the arguments regarding collective security and balance of power as a system of managing power. So, thank you very much.